Thanks very much for inviting me to present today. The title of the presentation is perhaps a little bit triumphalist, and I apologise, it's driven by brevity. The proper title would probably be something more like A New Approach to Analysing Victorian Coronial Material, which we believe has led to some new insights into Victorian pharmaceutical drug overdose deaths. And I also emphasise that although I'm presenting today, the material's drawn from a collaborative project between Turning Point and the Coroners Court of Victoria, and I'm here as a representative of the project team, and there's lots of other project team people here, which is lovely to see. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and the elders from other communities who may be here today. I thank very much the Victorian Law Enforcement Drug Fund who provided funding for this project, and also a big thanks to the Turning Point data coders, Adam and Bridget, who for about 6 months or so relocated from the warm, nurturing community of Fitzroy to the concrete desolation of South Bank. It's a journey akin to that of Frodo and Sam from the Shire to Mordor, but as history tells us, Frodo and Sam only made that journey once. Bridget and Adam did it several times a week. And also thanks to people from the Coroners Court who have contributed. The disclaimer is self-explanatory, and this is also the point at which I like to introduce my 30-minute guarantee on this talk. I guarantee I will not be talking for more than 30 minutes. I often find it comforting when I'm in the audience to know that a speaker will actually stop talking within a particular time frame, and I want to give you the same comfort that I enjoy. The context for our study was that most overdose deaths in Victoria are from combined drug toxicity, so that's the acute toxic effects of multiple drugs. And pharmaceutical drugs, particularly opioids, benzodiazepines and antidepressants, are the biggest contributors. Most overdose deaths involving illegal drugs are illegal drugs in combination with pharmaceutical drugs. And just on that point, there's been a lot of discussion of the heroin overdose death data out of the court for the finding in the death of Miss A. I note that 75% of those deaths were combined drug toxicity. They were not heroin alone. Also, granted, this Venn diagram, I love Venn diagrams, but this one's a bit old now, and there have been some recent developments in drug contribution. So just so you don't worry that I'm presenting stuff I was presenting 2 years ago, this is our latest preliminary data for 2016, also capturing the sort of 2015 trend stuff. And what we're seeing is that there is a continuing increase from 2015 in the proportion of deaths, overdose deaths in Victoria where illegal drugs are contributory. It's reaching up towards 60%, driven mostly by heroin and methamphetamine. But that doesn't mean there's been any decrease in pharmaceutical drug contribution. It's just all combined drug toxicity. And so when we're looking at, it's not like illegal drugs are displacing pharmaceutical drugs. The ubiquity of pharmaceutical drug contribution across overdose deaths in Victoria means that if we can understand more about the deceased and how they access the pharmaceutical drugs, we might be able to identify significant opportunities for death prevention. And that was the rationale for the VLEDF funded study. We took the period 2011 to 2013 and we reviewed the full coronial case file for 838 of the 894 Victorian overdose deaths that occurred during that period where one or more pharmaceutical drugs contributed. They were, in reality, or in practice, the 838 deaths where in the time allotted we could get a hold of the full case file and do the review. There's no systematic bias in what we did and didn't code. As you can see, about 50% of the deaths that we coded for the project were pharmaceutical drug only overdoses, and the breakdown of the rest is described there. For the study, we recorded a huge range of different information on each overdose death. This just sort of shows what some of the variables were. These are only some of the main variables captured that we hoped to be able to use to build typologies of Victorian pharmaceutical drug involved overdose deaths to identify potential countermeasures. And there's no way for me today to present everything that we've found here in the study so far, and we're yet to bring in our heavy statistical machinery to do the data strip mining that people love to do. So what I want to show you today is just a couple of early findings that I personally think are quite interesting because they illuminate issues that coroners have recently been investigating, both clinical issues and issues of policy. And I want to start with current clinically documented drug dependence among the deceased. We're interested in clinically documented drug dependence. We've also recorded drug dependence that is suspected or reported by family members, but we don't have any evidence that doctors knew about it. But for here, we're just interested in clinical documentation because it has a lot of implications for treatment pathways and the way that people engage in treatment. And what you can see is that overall, 63% of the deceased in our study cohort had current clinically documented drug dependence at the time of death, with 70% of males and around half of females. For both sexes, polydrug dependence was more prevalent. I haven't included the breakdown of drugs that were being used because it's not a central focus in this presentation, but for those who are interested, the single drug dependence, as you'd probably expect, was mostly alcohol, heroin or pharmaceutical opioids, and among the polydrug dependent it was a combination of alcohol, heroin, cannabis and benzodiazepines, with to a lesser extent amphetamines. You probably won't be surprised to see that for those who did not have clinically documented drug dependence, a high proportion of deaths involved pharmaceutical drugs only. It's not shown in this table, but for both males and females who had clinically documented drug dependence, they were on average more than 10 years younger than those who did not at the time when they died. So already from looking at this, we've got a couple of sort of tentative suggestions of ways that we might be able to break up the overdose deaths by contributing drugs and also based on history of drug dependence. So far it's not particularly profound insight. I just want to leave this for a moment and move to another characteristic and then bring back the drug dependence to sort of suggest the way it all comes together. So this is going now to diagnosed mental ill health, other than mental ill health that is related to drug dependence. 73% of the deceased had at least one current diagnosed mental illness at the time of death. Mental ill health was a little bit higher among women than men, but not by a whole lot. What we're interested in is the intersection between diagnosed mental illness and clinically documented drug dependence. And of particular interest to the Coroners Court is that half of all the deceased had both the diagnosed mental illness and clinically documented drug dependence. And even more, if we go a little bit further in looking at this, what this shows is the evidence for the duration of diagnosed mental illness and the duration of clinically documented drug dependence. And you can see that for most deceased, when we know what the duration is, it is greater than 10 years for drug dependence and greater than 10 years for diagnosed mental illness. So these are people who have been known to the health system for dual diagnosis for a very extended period of time. Just want to add one further factor here, which is in terms of intent, to sort of illustrate how a typology of overdose death could emerge from this data. Most of the unintentional overdose deaths occur among those who are drug dependent. Most of the suicides among those who've got a diagnosed mental illness. And there's a clear variation in how the two factors interact with each other with respect to intent in overdose death. But to get to the point, finally, behind all the numbers, for us, the purpose of experimenting with these typologies of overdose deaths is to identify meaningful features of deceased history and circumstances that we can then use to start looking in more detail at the deaths that sit within particular categories to identify themes and commonalities that might in turn suggest interventions. And for the overdose deaths among people with dual diagnosis, so I work in the Coroners Prevention Unit as a case investigator, and I'm frequently referred deaths by coroners of people with dual diagnosis who have a long history of diagnosed mental illness and drug dependence. And the recurring themes in the deaths that we get is, first of all, the overlap between them and the sort of confusing causality between the drug dependence, mental illness, and other things, such as a history of having suffered an injury from which they haven't fully recovered and so on. And what we see is that general practitioners are mostly left to deal with this extremely complex patient group without any ongoing support from specialists. And when the GPs need assistance, they refer the patient to a psychiatrist or a pain specialist or an addiction medicine specialist, but almost never to an AOD service. In fact, there is so little evidence we have of referral to AOD services that it's almost not worth reporting as a statistic. When specialists become involved, we frequently see their involvement as one-off or intermittent advice, with the general practitioner left to his or her own devices to execute a specialist's prescribing recommendations. And this is just a typical scenario, and this can happen across pain medicine, happens a lot across mental illness and across drug dependence. The ones with mental health are sort of particularly interesting at the moment for us. We have a whole cohort of deaths under investigation where a specialist, a psychiatrist has given advice on prescribing to the general practitioner, and 3 years later the general practitioner is still relying on that advice when the patient's presentation has changed and other drugs have been added and so on. We don't know what the solution is at the moment. It's something that we're starting to explore through the data, looking at some other elements of, what the data tells us about it, what might be able to be done. And there's a particular problem, we think, with the mentally ill patients, because unless they present with serious acute illness or in crisis, doctors know that they're never going to be able to access public mental health services. So one thing we're thinking about is maybe a MICAS, similar to DACAS, that could actually provide advice to doctors about prescribing to mentally ill patients, treatment of mentally ill patients over the phone, to assist where the doctor's worried that if I send them to ED, they won't be admitted because they're not in crisis or whatever. But I really need to know, because the last time I heard from this psychiatrist who's telling me to give 900 milligrams daily quetiapine or whatever was 3 years ago, and I'd really like to get some advice on whether that's still appropriate. I want to move now to the other sort of preliminary finding that's sort of more policy than clinical that I wanted to explore in this presentation, which has to do with the sources of the contributing pharmaceutical drugs in the deaths. The question of where did they come from? Through review of the coronial material, we were able to identify the likely sources of all contributing pharmaceutical drugs in 364 of the deaths, and the likely source of at least one contributing pharmaceutical drug in a further 337 deaths. Aggregating across these deaths, where all or at least some of the pharmaceutical drug sources were known, you can see 2/3 of the deaths involved only, so far as we know, pharmaceutical drugs sourced from prescription to the deceased. And overall, 607 deaths involved pharmaceuticals prescribed to the deceased. Diversion and over-the-counter purchase were far less prominent in the deaths. So, if we have a look in those 607 deaths where we know that all or some of the pharmaceutical drugs were prescribed to the deceased, what we're interested in is how many prescribers were involved in prescribing the contributing pharmaceutical drugs. And what we found, which was of some surprise to us, was that in 417, so a bit over 2/3, it was only a single prescriber involved in prescribing all pharmaceutical drugs that contributed to the deceased's fatal overdose. It's in quite sharp contrast to the depiction of the issue being that the people who die are doctor shoppers and there's the occasional rogue prescriber who might be responsible for this. I should add though, 147 deaths involving 2 or more prescribers is still a lot. It's 25% of all the deaths we looked at where we could identify at least some of the sources of the pharmaceutical drugs. And I also need to note that this is a conservative estimate because it includes only those deaths where we know 2 or more prescribers were involved and where we could identify the prescribers. We've got a number of deaths where we couldn't identify all or some of the prescribers, and they will bolster this number a bit, but we anticipate not a whole lot. These 147 are of interest in the court because they're the deaths that have driven the coroner's campaign for Victoria to introduce real-time prescription monitoring, and they're also the deaths that in the media are often referred to as the doctor shopping deaths or prescription shopping deaths. And I want to consider whether that is a fair description of them. This is the widely quoted definition of doctor shopping. And as you can see, it's basically all about the patient and what the patient's done wrong and the patient blame and responsibility in the process of obtaining the pharmaceutical drugs. Blaming the patient is something that we see a lot in the court with multiple prescriber deaths, particularly when doctors are asked to respond to questions about why they prescribed in the context of other doctors prescribing. And they repeatedly say, well, if the patient had told me they were going elsewhere, then, of course I wouldn't have prescribed. But I suspect that among these 147, there's a number, possibly even most of them, where the issue is not doctor shopping, it is coordination of care between multiple prescribers. And I've got 2 things in support of my hypothesis. So there are 2 different ways you can have multiple doctors involved in prescribing to a person. You can have the person attend multiple doctors to obtain the same drug, so go to this doctor for oxycodone, this doctor for oxycodone, this doctor for oxycodone. Or you can have the person attending multiple doctors to obtain different drugs, so this doctor for the diazepam, this doctor for the oxycodone, this doctor for the alprazolam. And when we looked at the deaths, what we found was that in 72% of the cases where there were multiple prescribers of pharmaceutical drugs that contributed to the overdose, that the deceased accessed different contributing drugs from different doctors. That is, the deceased didn't access any single contributing drug from more than one doctor. And in the other 20% of cases, at least one of the contributing drugs was prescribed by multiple doctors. To me, this tends to indicate that coordination of care between doctors prescribing different drugs to the deceased is probably as much of an issue that needs to be looked at just as much as doctor shopping. And I actually regard doctor shopping as a subset of the broader issue of coordination of care. And we're not allowed to say poor coordination of care, apparently. We're not allowed to say lack of coordination of care. At the moment, the code word in the court is suboptimal coordination of care. So this is evidence. The second piece of evidence is when we look at the prescribed drugs involved. So these are, on the left, the prescribed drugs where the deceased didn't get the same drug from more than one doctor, and on the right is when at least one of the drugs was obtained from more than one doctor. And I'm interested, and anyone who's seen me present before knows it's my particular obsession, methadone. It's the second highest drug on the list for those where there are multiple prescribers prescribing different drugs. And what's interesting, we looked at this in a couple of recent inquests, and we had expert evidence talking about the way that methadone is prescribed in opioid replacement therapy. And the underlying issue with the prescribing is that being that the big permit holders often don't do anything except opioid replacement therapy, and they refer off the patient to another doctor for treatment of co-occurring anxiety and depression, another doctor for treatment of whatever else. So the system is actually set up, and it's something that we see again and again in the overdose deaths, methadone-involved overdose deaths reported to the court. The system's actually set up so that multiple prescribers must be involved in treating your patient. And your problem is your patient has usually got a long history of drug dependence. So the treatment to the patient is not being coordinated. You get an increase in the methadone dose because it's not holding them in terms of their opioid cravings, or you get another doctor unilaterally deciding, well, I think I'll add amitriptyline for its, adjunct effect with the depression or whatever, and then all of a sudden you get the fatal overdose. There's been no coordination between the two lots of prescribers. So that's my theory on it. I'll skip over that slide. It actually doesn't fit with my narrative. It was part of my ongoing campaign against the way methadone is delivered. Methadone opioid replacement therapy is delivered in Victoria, but that's right, 3 times as much as any other drug. And in concluding, what I want to do is look at what these might mean for the real-time prescription monitoring system that is being planned to be implemented in Victoria. This is the way real-time prescription monitoring works in Tasmania at the moment. So at the bottom, the black is just sort of a basic model of the different ways that pharmaceutical drugs can get to a person, sort of a patient. So the main ways, so through direct prescribing, dispensed via the pharmacy, over-the-counter, diversion, internet pharmacy theft, illicit manufacturing, and so on. We know from our studies and from other studies that the main way is this triangle: patient, treating doctor, pharmacy. And what the Tasmanian process involves is it involves, on one hand, a real-time reporting system. So pharmacies report back information from drugs dispensed to the central system, and then through an interface, doctors and pharmacists can have a look at what's been dispensed to the deceased, and then they can determine, with that extra information, whether it's clinically appropriate to prescribe further drugs to the deceased. Sorry, I say the deceased, they're not deceased at that time, to the patient. And also, it provides an opportunity for interventions such as, look, you've been to 2 other doctors, I'm worried that you're getting too much diazepam, I'm concerned that you're also taking other central nervous system depressants and so on. But Tasmania also has another element, which is central DHHS monitoring, where they literally have clinicians sitting there having a look at what's coming in, and there are sort of heuristic alert systems to draw their attention to features of prescribing or proposed dispensing that may be of concern. And then they can call up the pharmacy and they can call the doctor and they can say, look, this is what's happening, we think you have to have a look at it. The benefit of that is that if you've got an issue where the issue is a single doctor prescribing to the patient, which is the majority of the overdose deaths that we're seeing, then that DHHS monitoring actually works as a fallback to hopefully pick up some of the concerning single doctor prescribing. It's not clear whether that's going to be included in the Victorian real-time prescription monitoring system. I'm not going to put anyone who's involved in that on the spot about whether it will be included, but it is an opportunity to intervene and to identify the single prescriber prescribing of concern. We see a lot of it in the court, and now that we've found that our central issue is actually appears to be with single prescriber overdose deaths, we're looking at it in more and more detail. So I anticipate that it's going to be sort of a direction of coronial investigations into the future. The data that's been gathered for the VLEDF, there's an enormous amount of stuff, and we're only starting to sort of get into it and make sense of it at the moment. And I think our hope is that it can be used to answer questions, sort of policy relevant questions that will increase the safety of the use of pharmaceutical drugs in Victoria. So, if people do have those questions, then you can always approach the court or Turning Point about the questions to see if we're able to answer them. Anyway, that's all I'll say. I'll note 23 minutes, 7 minutes less than I said that I would. So we can all celebrate that as well. Thank you very much. Thanks.